All right, Unit 2, Lesson 2, Introduction to Quadratic Relations. We're going to look at a few ways to tell what a quadratic relation or a quadratic graph is. So far, when you've done grade 9 and 10 math, you have looked at graphs of lines, which are linear relations. We're going to expand into grade 11 to quadratic relations. So I've given you two tables of values, and we are going to put the points on for those tables of values onto the graph. So when I do that, we'll see what happens. We're going to remember our X and Y axis. For those of you that don't like graphing, I guess you better get over that because we're going to be doing a bit of it. So for this table, -2, -3. So I'm going over to -2 and I'm going up 3 and I'm putting a point. And -1, going over to -1 and 0. And 0 and -1. And 1 and 0 and 2 and 3. And unlike the graphs we just did, these do not make a line. When they don't make a line, you've got to take your pencil and basically join them up in a nice, smooth curve. There we go. Let's look at the second table of values and put those points on. So first one, -2, -4. There's my first point. -1, -2, 0, 0, 1 and 2, and 2 and 4. And oh, that's more like what you're used to seeing. That's a nice little line. All those points are lined up for you. See if I can make a nice looking line here. My technology. Let's see, make my line a little thinner. Let's make it green, and we want to remember to put an arrow at the start and an arrow at the end. And maybe one more thing, I need to line it up a little bit better with my points. There we go. There are two graphs up there, two very different graphs. The one on the right you're used to seeing makes a nice straight line. It is a linear relation. The one on the left, however, does not make a nice straight line. It makes this kind of U shape. That kind of U shape comes from a quadratic relation. A quadratic relation has that U shape, and that U shape is called a parabola. And yes, you will need to know that word. And yes, you will need to know quadratic relations. So linear relation, straight line, and a quadratic relation has a parabola. Easy peasy. So you can tell a quadratic relation by the shape of its graph. It will be U-shaped. So number one, the graph of a quadratic relation is a parabola. A U-shaped symmetrical curve. If you wish, you can stop and do page 174. Another way to tell whether a graph is a quadratic or a linear relation is by the table of values. We talked about first differences the other day when we were reviewing concepts. First differences come from subtracting our y values, starting at the bottom of our table. So 16 take away 19 equals -3. And then I do 19 take away 24 would be -5. And then I do 24 take away 37 would be -7. And 31 take away 40 would be -9. And I can do that for both tables. Slide that down a little bit. 11 take away 7 is 4. 7 take away 3 is 4. 3 take away -1 is like 3 plus 1, so that's also 4. And -1 take away -5 is like -1 plus 5, so that's also 4. And we talked about the other day what it meant when the first differences were the same. When the first differences are the same, that would mean we have a linear relation or a linear graph. That one, however, does not have the same first differences. So that would mean that it is not linear. Now, it talks up here about second differences. Second differences, you just keep going with your table and you subtract your first differences. So I do -3 minus -5. Remember, that's like +5. -3 plus 5 would be 2. And I do the next one. -5 take away -7 would also be 2. And I do the next two. -7 take away -9 would also be 2. What that means when the second differences are the same is that it's a quadratic. It's a parabola. So a quadratic will have the same second differences, and a linear will have the same first differences. So we can tell by the graph. A quadratic is a parabola shape, a linear is a line. We can tell by the differences. The second differences for a quadratic are the same. Fancy word to say the same is constant. If you want to stop the video now and do page 175, number 2, you may do that. Last thing, equations. So we can tell by a graph, a quadratic is a parabola shape, a linear relation is a straight line. We can tell by differences. Linear relation has the same first differences. A quadratic relation has the same second differences. We can also tell by the equation. Let me get this little recording out of your way. All right, which are quadratic. And it might make sense because the second differences are the same when you have an exponent 2. When you have an exponent of 2, that would mean that you have a quadratic equation. So a quadratic equation always has an exponent of 2. That is why the second differences are the same. A linear equation, again, we're too lazy, but there's an exponent of 1 there. A linear equation will always have just an x or an exponent of 1 that we're too lazy to write down. And that should make sense because its first differences are the same. So that's it. 3 ways to tell whether you have a quadratic relation or a linear relation. Look at the graphs, look at the first and second differences, and look at the equations. So you can stop now, do the rest of page 175. If you didn't do the other questions as we work through the video, you need to go back to this beginning and do all the questions on page 175.